Near 2 months ago, I woke up from a nightmare. Screaming, apparently. My father used to have night terrors, but when asked about them, the source was never really fear. It was always some odd, or rather oddly mundane reason to scream, trying to get attention from someone who dropped their wallet, watching a baseball game. In that night, I remember I was afraid, or I wanted to cause fear. The last moments of my dream were me hiding in, having entered into, but also stuck in the trunk of a car in a poorly lit parking lot, isolated and alone. I dreamed that I was vulnerable, clothed in only rags, draped in layers over me, and that something encroached from the shadows. And so in rags, instead of burrowing, making myself small, giving in to vulnerability, I exited the trunk and started wailing, acting like a specter, like I thought a specter might. My perception diminished, my real-world waking was coming, though I couldn't make sense of it in the moment. I never do. I dream instead that I am tired, so very tired, as though sleep in dreams works in reverse, as though slumber is a conduit between worlds. In that moment, my senses were saddled with that dream drowsiness of waking, of a lethargy that comes to dreams in falling awake, anti-slumber. All I know is a presence and fear and presence, two factors trading places over and over. I am afraid. I am fear. There is a presence. I am the presence. Whatever was beyond me, it both was and was not a threat, my mind oscillating between the notion I was about to scare someone as amusement, about to scare something as self-preservation. I became a monster because it was an option and everyone has to be something. I became the monster because I wouldn't be victim to a bigger one, out in the dark, beyond my senses. Though that dream was about being a parking lot ghost, it reminded me of vampires. It reminded me of vampires within and beyond the world of darkness. It reminded me of being aware of a presence you can't see, but every other sense tells you to be wary of. It reminded me of Vampyr the Masquerade Bloodlines. But in the interest of my interests, I want to approach from a broad angle and narrow into talking about Bloodlines once we're on the same page. Indeed, I want to make this about more than one game. Vampire isn't a genre of game any more than pirate or cowboy, but they all signify some manner of distinct play stemming from a tightly defined role. Don't mind that asterisk, we'll get back to that. Further, I want to clarify that I do not, in this instance, include all games that feature vampires, nor even games where vampires are important to the world. No, that would include things like Castlevania 1. This is where vampire gameplay comes in. I want to explore the way games have approached the idea of being a vampire. I want to connect the tropes and hard rules, the traits of vampire play within the nascent medium of gaming, and try to, in turn, understand not only where this all comes from, but where it might be going. I want to explore the legacy that Vampyr the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 is inheriting. I want to imagine the ideal vampire game. From what I could find in a non-comprehensive Wikipedia search, there aren't many games before Blood Omen Legacy of Kain that have had the player playing as a vampire. If there are any, they're not the sort of thing that made a lasting cultural impact. Sorry if I missed some obscure Dracula edition of Super Buster Bros. Or whatever. First was a game in 1989 called Night Hunter that may not have ever been published, and then in 1990 there was a Japan-only game where you played as the son of Dracula, from what I can tell, and that game has a Super NES sequel that released in Japan in 1993 and North America in 1994. In 1995, a playable vampire character was included in a game called Bureau 13, which was based on a tabletop game. Quick note, the influence of tabletop roleplay going forward ranges from subtle and indirect to naturally quite obvious. One cannot discuss VTMB, that is, Vampyr the Masquerade Bloodlines, without talking about the tabletop World of Darkness, of course. World of Darkness being established in 1991 casts a long shadow, after all. Finally, Legacy of Kain came along in 1996 and Castlevania Symphony of the Night in 1997. These two are the first games on the list that have an enduring legacy, and they're also games I've actually played, so we're going to be looking here for our early exploration. I also suspect, forgive me, but I suspect there's not much for the future of the genre to learn from the twisted tales of Spike McFang. Further, the two games contrast well, highlighting a distinction that will remain relevant for the whole discussion: the difference between playing as a vampire and vampire gameplay. Now, to break down the difference between those two things, we need a basic, and I mean very basic, mutual understanding of what being a vampire is. A vampire is blood and fangs and bats and coffins and charm and strength, just as much as a vampire is gaunt features, paleness, the absence of a reflection, and shadows, and its weaknesses: garlic, crosses, stakes, running water, and the sun. It is a heap of myths and variations. The ideal vampire is all those things at once, maybe wearing a 19th century suit, maybe a cape. The interpretations and depictions are many, but there's still that core set of traits, the abilities, identifiers, and weaknesses. To give you a sense of the variation, I've left one trait off the list, one that is simultaneously very uncommon to vampire media in general and integral to the plot of Dracula. You can comment if you think you know what it is, but honestly, even adaptations of Dracula drop it. Vampires, according to Dracula, don't just sleep in edgy, cool coffins for the bit, but because they may only rest in the presence of their grave. And Dracula loopholes this by using the soil of his grave and shipping boxes of dirt. And look, we don't have to get into it, but you can see why that doesn't make it into lots of media, and certainly why it would be a clumsy game mechanic. Despite how many traits are part of the vampire, it's not like it's entirely mutable. Nobody is out there arguing that zombies count as vampires, even though they're both essentially undead cannibals. So, while each game in our list has its idea of what vampires are like, another might differ. Kain is weak to running water, Alucard is as well, but Bloodlines vampires are not. Some characteristics are negotiable, but two certainly endure more than others: the sun and blood. It is clear that vampires are defined in their strengths and aesthetic signifiers as much as their weaknesses. How do Kain and Alucard embody these strengths and weaknesses? How is gameplay informed by the ideal of vampirism? Now, this isn't an attempt to find the quintessential vampire gameplay experience and declare there is one true right way to do it, of course, but I do want to differentiate when vampire stuff is a coat of paint, an aesthetic, more than it is an influence on gameplay. I would say Legacy of Kain, though certainly steeped in aesthetic, doesn't stop at being goth AF. It does clearly think about what being a vampire means to gameplay beyond an excuse for a moveset. Symphony of the Night has a little less going on. About half less. This is me acknowledging Alucard isn't a full vampire, so lore people have less ground to get mad at me. This is the base of the contrast. Being a vampire, for Alucard, is borderline indistinguishable from being a wizard who knows how to strut. In terms of abilities, Alucard has some mythological vampire ones shared with Kain: bat transformation, wolf transformation, turning into mist, and blood drinking, sort of. Blood drinking, normally a core element of vampirism, is, for Alucard, relegated to a small thing you can do with the Dark Metamorphosis ability. Dark Metamorphosis! It only works on enemies that have blood, so we can surmise it is indeed blood drinking, but it only heals you just a little bit. It can be useful in the early game when you have double-digit health, but it falls off rapidly. It is not integral to play. Kain, on the other hand, cannot heal from save points or potions, and so the ability to draw blood from humans, which isn't done with a bite or voluntarily, by the way, is more important to the gameplay loop. Your health is your blood. There is not another source. It turns out this is what the Bible and the Goth Bible meant when they said the blood is the life. More than the gradually unlocked abilities shaping what it means to play as Kain, we feel that the weaknesses take a bigger role in defining gameplay. The first thing Kain says after stepping from his grave into the outside world is the fact that the sun and rain are now sources of weakness.
I had not expected such cruelty from the light, for in the embrace of the sun I could find no comfort, only malice. This would change in time for the worse, along with other things. When rainfall comes, vampires are wise to find shelter from its acidic touch.
Alucard's only relevant natural weakness in Symphony of the Night is water. Sunlight isn't part of gameplay, and crosses and garlic are never a danger. The gameplay of being Alucard never involves the sun or blood to any significant degree. From a strict game design position, certain weaknesses are the perfect excuse for progression systems. Oh, a weakness to water, you say? We can gate the player's progress by adding a stream or lake they'll have to figure out how to bypass later. The key to vampire gameplay, actually, is not the strengths that define someone like Alucard, but the weaknesses that shape or transform the nature of someone like Kain, and by extension, transform the nature of gameplay. While neither of these games have strong vampiric themes, Legacy of Kain is a game that does not eschew narrative. Nobody can make a claim like that when it's half soliloquy by weight.
The necromancer had offered me no warning as to what my resurrection would entail, and yet I must confess in my haste I had not sought one. Was his gift a curse? I would seek the pillars for an answer.
Okay, hold up actually, I need to say this now or I'll never know peace. Symphony of the Night might be iconic for its "what is a man" dialogue, but it gets excused as being bad because games didn't care about acting and scripts back then, and can we really say that when Legacy of Kain came first? Obviously, part of that is down to translation and dubbing and the interest of putting effort into it, but I just want to set the record straight that it's not like games were just hokey bad voice acting before Metal Gear Solid. Also, it's not like Metal Gear Solid changed that. Despite the storytelling quality and the degree of immersion that comes from quality storytelling, Blood Omen doesn't quite care about your ability to interact with the world in any way but killing things. This isn't a lewd narrative dissonance thing, by the way. Kain loves his new job. The point is more that, in the face of its combat focus, it's similar to Symphony of the Night, but it is radically dissimilar in that one is exploring a bigger space and there are non-hostile NPCs seemingly going about their normal lives. It's not one gigantic dungeon, it's a land with towns and denizens. But despite that, social interactions are almost non-existent. This is of course a very different setup to Bloodlines, which is a very conversational game by comparison. It also, despite taking place in the real world so to speak, bothers to introduce its setting through characters and a slow revealing of the world vampires inhabit. Kain, conversely, instinctively knows all there is to know about vampirism. He's feeding you lore 10 seconds after waking up.
Reputed to have been ripped from the chest of the greatest vampire to have ever existed, Janos Audron, the Heart of Darkness.
There's no time devoted to getting to know this new dark world from an outsider's perspective. The distinction between Blood Legacy's Solo and Kain Reaver and Bloodlines is that while Kain is a terror upon mankind and Kain fights other creatures of the night, that's most all of what he can do. It demonstrates vampire gameplay with the mindset of humanity as, at most, lesser beings to be bartered with or cut down for attacking you, and, at most diminished, health pack cattle. Legacy of Kain does not allow one to play as part of society. As an extension of this, well, as Mandalore said in his review of the game,
the good ending is just a flyover of trees talking about how you save the world. They use the same kind of cutscene sometimes you travel in bat form, so this is really tacked on.
This is the best way to sum up that this game isn't just a demonstration of vampire gameplay, but one where you're an unavoidably evil character. It's one of the rare instances I can think of where the interest of forcing moral complexity into the game is done by adding a good ending. The vampire themes, if there are any, in Kain's case, are mostly found in the aforementioned predation upon humanity. Themes won't become all that relevant till later in the history of vampire games, for the most part. Despite this inclusion of a last-second good guy button, Kain's story is pretty much set in stone. Alucard's story is a question of true endings more than deviating paths. Ultimately, in either of these games, you're not just being a vampire, you're being specific concrete characters, and those characters are vampires. You are playing as Kain and Alucard, and the personalities are written for you. The dialogue happens on its own. Your input is motion. And that only gets us so far when you consider what separates Kain gameplay from the ideal of vampire gameplay, so to speak, and where this is headed with respect to Bloodlines. So let's look at this from a different angle. Since it's pertinent to talk about player-made characters, roleplay characters, I'm going to take this as an excuse to talk about the Elder Scrolls for a bit. Firstly, because it's a series that treats being a vampire as an element of a personalized character, there are mechanics necessary to make vampire gameplay feel distinct from being a regular RPG sword guy or whatever. It has vampire gameplay, but we all know it's not a game about being a vampire, and there's something to explore in that. Secondly, vampire gameplay takes two forms, dedicated and ancillary. There are games about being a vampire, and those that simply let you be one. There are games in which it's an addition to a broad world of roleplay, and ones where it's the sole lens for seeing the world. The Elder Scrolls is very obviously the former. And so we start with a fantasy world that has done vampirism in a few ways, and some of them surprisingly well. But it's noteworthy that for its alleged position as a power fantasy, vampirism in the Elder Scrolls carries a question from game to game of, is it worth it? Is vampirism powerful enough to outweigh the downsides? From this, it follows that for many players, vampirism is most impactful by virtue of the weakness it confers. Let's step back a tiny bit. In general, open-world adventure games don't tend to model human needs for the player unless that's a selling point. Things like eating, drinking, and sleeping are relegated to a survival mode if they exist at all, or they're the entire point of the game. While playing games like Tears of the Kingdom or Skyrim, you, as player, are generally indifferent to the time of day by default, aside from NPC schedules and occasional visibility concerns. In fact, Tears of the Kingdom is more concerned with survival than Skyrim if you consider that temperature matters in that game. In-game clocks wouldn't be relevant. Lunchtime isn't something on your mind. You do not have needs like food and water. Vampirism in the Elder Scrolls disrupts that. Suddenly, as an inhuman predator, a monster among men worthy of fear, you have finally developed a need to feed. You are now, in some sense, chartered by the sun. Against it. You go from having zero reason to care what time it is, your character ostensibly never sleeping unless you need to level up or heal or something, to timing your play around sunsets. You'll find yourself resting more than ever, managing your needs more than ever, having needs for the first time ever. Vampire play in a world where it is shaped by the new limitations, especially in a game with few limitations beforehand, feels like a debuff. The trade-off mechanically is some spells, varying strength buffs. It's telling that one has to ask in which Elder Scrolls game is vampirism worth it and for what reason. Blurring the lines between mechanic and narrative incentives, we have quest rewards which themselves vary between middling to good to useless to a non-vampire. The way vampirism is something to be weighted and considered as a gameplay decision stands out like a glowy-eyed freak in a Jarl's court, in a game where the only time one has to think about accepting power is when there's some sort of exclusivity situation or you get one of two quest rewards. Let's run through the depictions of vampire gameplay throughout the Elder Scrolls series. Daggerfall was the first Elder Scrolls game to go from vampires being just a strong enemy to playable, having region-based clans of differing abilities and vampire-specific quests. That said, they were not distinct clan-related quests, and like most quests of Daggerfall, they are radiant, as opposed to uniquely crafted, meaning they're kind of like a Mad Lib auto-generated quest design. I need you to go to place name variable, and verb, a noun. Return back to me for number, gold. Skyrim uses this too. You might recall the famous example of, a new hand touches the beacon. Becoming a vampire comes with most of the core traits, weakness to sunlight, i.e. ticking damage when outside in the sun, and a need to feed, balanced against free spells and stat buffs. It should be noted that there was also a weakness to holy places, not just the sun, which is kinda cool. Also, feeding was just something that happened automatically when you killed a living creature. One more core trait that feels poetic to mention given where this all started is dreams. Your sleep is troubled by nightmares of a beautiful woman whom you murder in a dark place. Dreams are given a special place within the Elder Scrolls vampire experience, starting with Daggerfall. The prominence of these nightmares is likely a reference to the role of dreams within Carmilla and Dracula. This is another one of those vampire traits that isn't universal and indeed doesn't make it into most games we're covering, but is a thematic association. This will come back in future Elder Scrolls games. Speaking of Stages of vampirism were yet to exist, so failing to feed had a different consequence, the inability to rest, which is even more important in Daggerfall than in Morrowind, because none of your meters naturally tick back up. Tangentially, it's funny that depending on when one started the series, they'd have very different understandings of what fatigue meant. In Skyrim, it's called stamina, and it only drains from obvious things like sprinting and sword swings, and restores quite fast. In Oblivion, it's a combat-only thing aside from jumping. In Morrowind, it drains from going faster than walking speed, so it's meant to be managed, and running out in a fight can be dangerous, but it's still gradually replenished. In Daggerfall, it's more like a meter of your overall energy/consciousness. It goes down every in-game hour, even if you're standing still. You have to rest to restore it. It's not a representation of when you're out of breath, it's a representation of how close you are to collapsing. If the bar zeroes out, you pass out. If that happens in combat, you will get stabbed to death. You can see why it's an issue if you can't rest then. There will be an ongoing trend of the changes in gameplay between games, of course, impacting the workings of vampire gameplay, but it's important to note that Daggerfall vampirism did not start off overly simple or overly powerful. That all said, Morrowind's approach to vampirism is probably the most drastic. None of the other games are as aggressive about flat out cutting you off from large portions of the world while also providing new factions only available to vampires. Indeed, where the weakness that shapes your play most in the future titles is the sun, what hits hardest in Morrowind is that you're shunned from society. Only 2 factions will tolerate vampirism, and surprise, that means you can't use any conventional fast travel methods beyond the Mage Guild teleports. You have to play the game very differently with that in mind. Morrowind also has a set of dreams related to transformation and hunger. The first one is always the same. I dreamt of a blonde maiden. I drew near and saw she was crying, but her tears were red as blood. I touched her tears and tasted them, and they were wonderfully salty, sharp with spice and savor. But the maiden's face had changed, her skin gray-white, and red tears dripped from her lips, and her hair had turned black and wreathed her head like twining snakes. I was afraid, but I could not run. I screamed, and then I woke, heart pounding, cramped and aching. From there are a few others you'll encounter when resting. We're still not at the point where there are stages to vampirism that decide if you're just a gaunt weirdo or if it's kill on sight time. Morrowind's vampirism is binary. You can't be a vampire and be fully undetected as one. You can wear a helmet, and that helps, or no, just kidding, that's something NPCs say but the game doesn't follow through on? Oops. The people who will tolerate you won't actually converse with you, they just won't try and kill you for talking to them. You lose access to every guild spell vendor in the game, despite the 2 factions who tolerate you being the Mages Guild and Telvanni Mushroom Wizard guys. As a vampire, you play as an outcast from normal society, and you feel it. But you are also introduced to something else. For you see, there are clans of vampires hidden in the world, in caves and crypts, and honestly, it's a pretty meager existence. For those of you familiar with Vampyr the Masquerade, the term vampire clan might elicit some expectation of elaborate societies or a parallel world of the night, but in practice, the vampires of Morrowind are far from powerful. Morrowind vampire clans are more like loose bands of blood bandits than mysterious overlords or secretive seducers. They do not, by and large, live among society and hardly have their own society as an alternative. There are also those without a clan, outcasts among outcasts, who describe themselves as lone hunters. The clans are hostile to each other, they want each other dead. The world knows of them and wants them dead, and is right to do so. As a vampire, your comrades are few, your world is very small in Morrowind. Oblivion pared things down. Some quests have vampire characters, but the only vampire quest itself is curing vampirism. That said, vampires are more of an integrated presence in the world of Oblivion. They're more than an enemy type, more than cave dwellers, and the vampire NPCs feature in parts of several guild quest lines at one point or another. Oblivion also introduced stages of vampirism in which you become more monstrous the longer you've gone without feeding. These stages finally allowed you to live as a vampire secretly. Well-fed vampires are impossible for the average villager to distinguish from a normal person. As the vampire neglects to feed, the vampirism becomes stronger and manifests more in a physical sense. Abilities improve and more spells are unlocked. Ostensibly, the vampire is becoming deadlier in desperation. However, this progression feels arguably backwards. While I do see the case for vampirism becoming stronger when having not fed and how that concept of desperate strength is compelling, the inverse stands up just as well. I feel an argument could also be made that vampires should be strongest when well fed. Blood is the life after all. The incentive structure in-game is muddled. Being blood-starved is a drastic trade rather than just a bad thing. One becomes far stronger but less tolerated, and far weaker to the sun in particular. This sets up a bit of an issue that will come back with Skyrim. Either way, Oblivion contributes a little more beyond the stage system and regresses from elements present in Morrowind and indeed Daggerfall. Skyrim is interesting in that it originally more or less followed the trajectory of Oblivion, making the vampire playstyle less relevant than the previous entry. That is, until the vampire-themed DLC, Dawnguard, was released. The quick story recap is that a vampire guy named Harkin who has lived off the coast of Skyrim has a cool daughter named Serana who has been asleep in a box for thousands of years, and she holds an Elder Scroll necessary for the bad guy to advance his goal of being able to blot out the sun and begin the era of vampire ascendancy. Now, from that alone, we see there's more going on than Oblivion. Vampires are getting a main plot arc. Your place as the player is to either fight against them or half join them. You can become a vampire, but it would be in opposition to Harkin long term, not as an underling. In the end, you can sort of steal his plan out from under him, but it's not that you can end the tyranny of the sun or whatever so much as cause eclipses when you want. That's relevant to our purposes of exploring vampire gameplay, and that it is ostensibly the reward for completing the arc. You can shield yourself from one of the game-impacting drawbacks. And along the way, there are other rewards as well, a transformation and some abilities. And something else comes from Dawnguard. They actually made it less punishing to be a vampire. The trade-offs are rendered less extreme. NPCs don't even attack you on sight as the highest stage of vampirism, unless you become this thing. You don't sizzle in the sun anymore. Instead, passive regeneration is curtailed. Honestly, from a pure design perspective, this makes a lot of sense. Being a vampire in the older games was always a niche choice to spice up a run, or a necessary dip for completionists, at least for Morrowind. But most times I saw vampirism come up, people were looking for ways to get around the limitations, or saw the trade-offs as net negative. And I'm inclined to agree. In a game where it's easy to max stats and cast magic, being a vampire doesn't transcend human limitations. Oblivion especially, I felt the compulsion to run a vampire character because of the setting, and I just felt burned by it. Literally, I guess. And that's where the stage progression comes back. Skyrim no longer has attributes to buff, so the vampire bonuses outside of spells are rather limited, but at the same time, the negatives of not having fed are dampened. One could be a stage 4 vampire at all times, and it wouldn't actually affect play too deeply. Of course, having your magic and health and stamina not regenerate when standing in daylight is impactful, but in a funny way, it just makes it like playing Morrowind or Daggerfall. The overall gameplay changes present in Skyrim have informed what vampirism does to the player, and it's far less punishing than burning to death. Keeping some drawbacks but making them less brutal is a departure from the old ethos in an attempt to make vampirism approachable. It's an attempt to give mechanical reasons to be a vampire more than just RP reasons. As a developer, you don't want to put in tons of work to flesh out and redefine a system only for players to go, not worth it, and never see that side of the game. The developer incentive is to either not focus on a hyper-niche gameplay style, or to make the style less niche. From here, we get to the DLC exclusive Vampire Lord form, which makes you look like this and provides an appreciable boost to one's abilities. With it came the Vampire Lord perk tree, granting new enhancements and abilities using a special form of experience. Kills while in the Vampire Lord form. Kills in video games are a common form of experience, but Skyrim has action-based EXP. You swing a sword, you get better at sword. So this is an interesting departure that I'm fixating on for absolutely no reason, don't worry about it. In the lore, it is the ability of a select, pure bloodline close to the direct source of vampirism itself, not something just any vampire can do. It doesn't, however, drastically alter gameplay. It affects combat, augmenting the ability to hit things and cast spells, which is, for sure, a large part of the Elder Scrolls experience, but technically you're just doing what you always did, just with some buffs, a levitation animation, and forced third-person camera. I will say that despite the enhanced focus specifically on vampires, the implied world of them feels even smaller this time around. In general, there's a thing with Elder Scrolls games that I think maps onto the gaming landscape more broadly, where the more things you render, the less is left to imagination. I don't suspect Bethesda could ever do Valenwood justice compared to what they have written down about moving tree cities. And this is already apparent in Dawnguard. Well, okay, so there's Harkin McBadguy and his gang, and they've been around for thousands of years on a goth island doing nothing. Harkin's daughter, Serana, is literally older than the Empire, but there aren't any other groups, really. The implication of centuries of existence would be centuries of presence, of influence, but it's threadbare. There's a few dungeons vampires are hanging out in, and at most there's a guy running a drug cartel, but he can't even be interacted with. Even though Morrowind has all of its clans living on the fringe and stuff, the plurality of choices created an illusion of depth. The existence of options is like a kind of world-building parallaxing. In Skyrim, one gets less a sense that there is a parallel or hidden society as with the clans of Morrowind, and more a sense that Harkin's specific faction exists as a gang of guys on their evil villain island, and that's 95% of the country's vampires. Where Morrowind did it best in how it altered play, Skyrim did it best by virtue of dedicating a whole expansion to vampirism. So while it lacks the world of vampire clans and the implications that come with that of a deeper world just past what the player is allowed to understand, it does come with more mechanics and a narrative around vampirism. Morrowind, by being a crystallization of the formula set out by Daggerfall and, as I said, implying a world, approached changing the game in a very different way. We come back to that question of gameplay versus aesthetic and where these games fall within those categories. Ultimately, yes, there is vampire gameplay more than you're just aesthetically a vampire. The way you play does change, but it's not drastic. The answer isn't clean, and it rubs against the far more unapproachable topic of approachability. Again, Skyrim got more people to actually try being a vampire. Skyrim got closest to solving the "is it worth it" question. With that said, both presentations have something for us to learn from when it comes to vampire gameplay. I think the Elder Scrolls world sometimes understands vampire culture when they bother to tell vampire stories. The games both present vampirism and a degree of social interaction, certainly far more than something like Blood Omen or Symphony of the Night, and from that we approach the juncture, vampirism and social play. Going forward, this will take more precedence, and going forward, we will also have to explain why social components are integral to fully realizing vampire gameplay. The impact from the Elder Scrolls is part centered on the notion of the player character, and part on the integration of vampirism into the broader world, and from that, the world of the vampires themselves. It is, in some ways, poised to have a whole culture in the open, a niche of its fantasy world where vampires are a people, a civilization all their own, so to speak, rather than intrinsically the other, rather than solitary hunters, feared foreigners, or reclusive lords. And it doesn't take the full leap. We are led to believe that there are a few vampire ruins here and there, but there is not truly a culture. One guy liked gargoyles. One individual, singular guy who was goth as hell and had 12 friends, built spooky archways and blood-activated things. Hand-stabbing vault coffin mechanism things. But they're not spread across this world, implied to have once been parallel to it, as night is today. In a sense, the depictions across the games flip between this solitary and group approach to the concept of vampirism. Morrowind has clans, Oblivion has loners, Skyrim has one core group. The gameplay has certainly changed to a degree, largely through the newly imposed restrictions. Feeding becomes a new element of the gameplay loop, something to be done when you're also back in town selling dungeon treasures, or an opportunity to be seized when happening upon the odd sleeping bandit. By the time of Skyrim, it's more than a mere aesthetic change, but it cannot be as deep as a game dedicated to vampire gameplay. All this laid out as a thing to contrast. A baseline of sorts for what a world with so many options praised for immersion thinks of being a vampire. It's here that we step outside of games for a moment and address the idea of themes. Vampires are famously a metaphor for no one thing. There are a range of options that tend to most often fixate on a few pairs of ideas. Otherness and sexuality, wealth/power and parasitism, blessings and disease. And, well, those three pairs alone offer a tremendous range. And all of that misses the clear point that perspective is crucial here. Vampires as protagonists, antagonists, anti-heroes, they'll all get different characterizations, as will their powers. It can get murky. Otherness and sexuality can mean anything from liberatory queer readings to intrinsic staples of a conservative ethos, a lens of fear cast upon foreigners, upon sexuality, where the other becomes negative. Power and parasitism invokes class, but in ways that blur on either extreme end of the socioeconomic spectrum and rely on highlighting one or the other. If you make them classy, refined, and cool, doesn't that just kind of make rich people seem cool? How often are vampires poor? Despite the fact that in most Elder Scrolls games all the vampires live in tombs and dirt caves, vampires aren't often depicted as part of a downtrodden lower caste. By nature, they have power, even if it is the product of a dark bargain. Finally, Blessings and Disease asks the quintessential question of dark power. Is it a gift or a curse? Is it an infection, something to be purged, something that carries immense risk? Or is it something to be gifted, to be shared, to tempt one into? Is it something that makes one the apex of apex predators, immortal and enduring, or merely above mortality yet doomed to inhuman weakness? Indeed, for all the focus on powers and newfound immortality, vampire fiction also often highlights new threats. And one old one. The sun, garlic, silver, crosses, vampires are known for their weaknesses as much as, if not more than their powers. This we've already addressed. But there's one more weakness, a very human worry. They cannot escape hunger. This is where I find another conflict with the idea of the vampires as a negative allegory for the real world, wealthy and powerful. Sure, things like an aversion to sunlight can be a soldier soul kind of metaphor, being stripped of the joy of touching grass in the daytime or whatever, bereft of the pleasant experience of having the sun blind you mid-brunch. But what gets me about the hunger issue is that hunger is a need for the poor. Yes, one could say something about the idea of how violent their hunger is, that it consumes lives, that it kills, that it predates. But the metaphor assumes it is necessary, not merely to keep up an untenable standard of living, but to live at all. To that end, I don't feel comfortable consigning the works that make vampirism alluring and cool to a doing it wrong position. Nor do I find class readings to be especially more salient or true to the original intent or any such thing. Ultimately, there is a parallel in the difficulty of pinning down vampire themes, in that they share a certain mutability with describing vampire traits. Just as there is blood and sunlight and agelessness, there is predation and darkness and longevity. Just as there are garlic and running water, the secondary characteristics, there are secondary themes, selectively applied, like those of othering and sexuality. The lack of rigidity in both definitional parts of vampire fiction, in defining a vampire as much as in anticipating the themes of a vampire narrative, means the same thing. Vampires are a loose concept that must be defined with every fiction, or risk inviting all manner of presumptions. The expectations of what vampire gameplay will be are honestly more informed by the myths and themes than they are previous games in this thing that's too small to truly call a genre, possibly to such a degree that the literary ideas from which vampirism emerged have more power over the shape of Bloodlines 2 than Bloodlines itself. And so it is that we're finally ready to talk about Vampyr the Masquerade Bloodlines, and with it, explore what I think the former project of development studio Heartsuit Labs, now current project of the Chinese Room, Vampyr the Masquerade Bloodlines 2, has to do right in order to capture the same magic. That is, after all, an indirect goal of this video. In explaining vampire gameplay, we are set up to understand future games. The reason I've talked around Bloodlines, the reason I've started with different games, is that addressing Bloodlines first risks presuming it is either the apex or has a special place as a source for Bloodlines 2 to draw from. Obviously, it has a strong place. It is the first game in the series, but I think it's important to look at the wider genre as well as the general fiction conventions and separate them from VTMB, both to understand what else is out there and to highlight what makes Bloodlines special. You may notice that so far every game has taken place in some kind of fantastical fantasy setting. A game that would subvert this trend is Vampyr, but I can't be bothered to pay $40 for it. Oh, okay, well, let's get into it then. Admittedly, this upsets the chronology of things a bit, because Vampyr, in all possibility, was inspired by Bloodlines 1, but I want to show everything else before we get to Bloodlines proper. With that said, it's not like Vampyr is outright derivative, a Bloodlines-like, so to speak, and indeed, it has some of its own lessons for us to explore. First off, this game has a protagonist that is more Geralt-y than Bethesda-y. You play as Dr. Jonathan Reed, recently returned from the front of World War I into a decaying London. He is a man with a set past, a face, a family, and a name. Oh, and amnesia. He's learning who he is and the state of the world right along with us. The gameplay follows suit, where Bloodlines allows for a variety of clans and backgrounds and comes with very few ties to the pre-vampirism past. Vampyr has Dr. Reed exist with one set past and one set of potential abilities, with the choice of when to grow but not how, with the choice of how to be but not who. With infinite experience in VTMB, you cannot have every skill in the game on one character, no matter what. With Vampyr, the perfect Jonathan exists and is the same as all the others. This is a good way to highlight that self-made characters, as a tradition stemming from Bloodlines' tabletop roots, are not the only way to make a social vampire game. In fact, they both are and are not important to what Bloodlines wants to be and what I, and others, expected of a sequel. The gameplay of Vampyr consists of combat and social interaction. That combat includes cool vampire moves like flash stepping and blood projectile darts, which is par for the course, I suppose. On the social end, the game emphasizes knowledge of people. It is, in fact, a game that is far more about social interactions than the ones we've covered so far. And with that comes our first crack at manipulations.
Tom, talk to me about the visit from your old friend, William.
Yes, Will came by tonight, but he's not my friend anymore.
Depictions of vampiric manipulation are often a casualty of the fact that social interaction is not generally as explored as physical violence in games. Indeed, beyond having a free speech check passed or the same illusion spells as anyone else, how could the Elder Scrolls depict the unsettling magnetism in anything more than a stat buff? The true power of getting into people's heads can only be depicted in a game that allows for conversation, and, more importantly, sheltered feelings and thoughts. Things to be drawn out, weaponized. In other games, this at best manifests as a charm spell, an enthralling, so to speak. If we look to Dracula or Carmilla, the magnetic nature, the inability to refuse, to think rationally against the wishes of the vampire, is an important element of their power, and it is one that, before now, could not be addressed as gameplay. Bloodlines 1, of course, has this as well, but more in the vein of forcing a conversation success. It isn't as dramatic or potent when it's ostensibly the same thing as a seduction or persuasion result. Conversation is well within, and indeed more the center of Vampyr developer Dontnod's work. The thing that launched them to relevance was, after all, Life is Strange. Further, when I said this game might have been inspired by Bloodlines, I did mean that. But if anything, it reminds me more of Pathologic, particularly things like having bound characters you're responsible for. Beyond that, there are some interesting aesthetic comparisons to Pathologic too, but not a tangible connection to draw. The point is that combat is not a focus here, and some might call it the weakest part of the game. Foreshadowing, this isn't a huge problem in the grand scheme. The question of indulging in one's vampiric urges is the game's version of a moral choice, with the trade-off being that draining non-combat victims makes you permanently stronger, allowing you to level up your abilities. This creates a situation where one is actually incentivized to indulge in vampirism without it just being an edgy dark side run for the sake of edge, as might be the case with a game like Knights of the Old Republic, where you seldom even get a better material reward for being evil. There is a motivation that goes beyond, well, they gave me the option so I might as well try it out, or hee hee ha ha, evil is fun. I mean, Kain would pick the last one. It's also important to note that Vampyr is a world where events are presumably the same as our real-world history up until the events surrounding the First World War, at which point it diverges as influenza has struck London far harder than it did historically, accompanied by a vampire plague thing. Within that world, vampires are themselves a known idea, but thought to be a myth. Dracula is a book within the world of the game. Bloodlines also takes place in our timeline, so to speak, though it is implied that vampires have influenced historical events in both cases, of course. Counter to the Elder Scrolls, where interactions with NPCs are limited in general, and to something like Blood Omen, where humans exist to be fed upon, Vampyr is both concerned with setting and with what kind of role someone like Jonathan Reed plays within that setting.
You are not a burden, sir. Healing you is my responsibility.
And you have my gratitude for that.
Vampyr is about being between states. Dr. Reed does not hold some antipathy or contempt for humanity, doesn't instantly see them the way most people might see animals as food. But he does feed on them. He is a doctor and a killer. He is part of the human world, of human society, and privy to the other world. I keep bringing up the idea of vampire societies because that's where Bloodlines goes. In doing so, I've effectively stacked the deck towards the idea that vampires are group-minded. I'm sure certain readings of Dracula could draw that out of the work in his creation of new vampires and all. But I don't think there's much to the idea of vampirism that necessitates dark courts and blood aristocracy and secret societies and all that. Vampires can readily function as the wolf among sheep. I'd say Kain is more like that. He is, at least, solitary. But he's somehow less subtle than a wolf would be. Vampyr didn't have to include other vampires, to include organizations dedicated to their study, to their hunting, an implied shadow war. It could have been the story of some lone man transformed into a vampire by some other solitary hunter while the rest of the world is ignorant to it all. That would be more in the spirit of Dracula proper. Ultimately, vampire society is another thing we're used to as some manner of vampire trope that isn't actually core to the original concept. And from this, you're ready to see why I said that Vampyr might be the thing that was inspired by Bloodlines and goes on to inspire Bloodlines 2. With that in mind, it's finally time to dig into Bloodlines. Let's pick up from where I jokingly cut off before. Vampyr the Masquerade Bloodlines is based on Vampyr the Masquerade, a tabletop RPG which is part of the larger World of Darkness setting. Said World of Darkness is ostensibly our world with fantastical elements rather than outright swords and sorcery style fantasy. Technically, the broader World of Darkness includes mages, ghosts, and fae and stuff, but our world's actual history has, on the surface, happened as usual. Other games have, of course, done this. It is, in some sense, an organic progression from the source material that is Dracula. From this, Bloodlines does something other more typical magical fantasy settings could never do. It makes vampires special. There's not a, like, Scoob, vampires are real moment to be had in Blood Omen or the Elder Scrolls. They're a fact of life in those worlds. Or a fact of unlife, I guess. Establishing that, Bloodlines becomes more than just a game where you are a vampire. It becomes a game about being a vampire in a human world. A human world that isn't supposed to know you exist. I mean, okay, is that a grand revelation? That's literally the titular Masquerade. Hey, where did the word Bloodlines go? Gotcha, it's time for one last fake out. There's one more thing we have to note before going forward. The fact that World of Darkness is a tabletop setting all its own, and that Bloodlines isn't the only Vampyr the Masquerade game either. In one sense, this makes a lot of the things I said Bloodlines did actually a bit of a misdirection. The Masquerade setting and all its lore, Bloodlines inherited that. It's an adaptation of a fictional world made in 1991 expressly around the idea of being a vampire. With that came the idea of a parallel society of vampires. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that this series has been influential enough that we don't even ascribe its influence. We're at the point where there is a parallel society of vampires is an accepted trope. Hell, it's one I've tried to write before. The idea of society, rather than lone hunters or viral curses, appeals far more to me. That's half the reason this video exists. Also, mind you that since we're talking about tabletop games, the question of additions becomes very important. I'll be referring to V5. V20 is, as I understand, closer to Bloodlines, but I'm less versed with it. In fact, I'm not excessively versed with the tabletop as a whole, but I intend to do my best. This will also be relevant for later comparisons with Bloodlines and trying not to blur too much with versions. One thing that stands out between editions and will be relevant is that V5 focuses on personal struggle more. Let's establish the base importance of VTM using the Masquerade itself. There's something very natural, haha, to the idea of a world that has secret monsters who don't want to be found. It's so natural, in fact, that when I first played Bloodlines, the idea of not violating the Masquerade wasn't something that I had any questions about. It just made sense. And that's why it's interesting that for all the vampire gameplay out there, so much of it centers on worlds where the idea of being detected has more to do with personal threat than the revelation of otherworldliness. The threat of detection in Oblivion is getting murdered for being an implied murderer and/or monsters. Vampires individually hide their nature, but vampires on the whole aren't a secret. The idea of vampirism being unknown to the average person isn't mechanically present in other games, despite how natural a mechanic that is, and sometimes despite a narrative element claiming some manner of secrecy. The idea of the Masquerade is partly present in a game like Vampyr, but it is not the genre norm. Secrecy is not an express theme of other vampire media either, but it is an organic and implicit one that naturally informs gameplay. Outside of video games, but within the realm of tabletop games, it's been with us since 1991. So much of this has. That means that this whole time, since before Blood Omen even, VTM was potentially an indirect influence on anyone seeking to make a vampire game. And in turn, Bloodlines is a multi-layered crystallization of the genre. And so it is now our task to understand its roots. How does Vampyr the Masquerade do vampire gameplay? Oh, where do I even start? Alright, speaking towards the 5th edition in specific. The general idea of Vampyr the Masquerade is that the players around the table are vampires. Good. Duh. There is blood drinking and murder and subterfuge, but there's also multiple forms of persuasion, questions of remorse, struggling to retain humanity, and the beast. The beast is, to be overly simplistic, the call of going feral, of becoming a mindless predator. The mechanical depth afforded to a game expressly about vampires is obviously going to be rich. This allows for entire mechanics to revolve around one's ability to not give in to temptation, to stop oneself from drinking someone to death, to stop from wanton killing, to not give in to the beast, and lose one's humanity. In creating a character, rather than a class, one has a clan. These clans limit what a character's range of talents, behavioral tendencies, and weaknesses are. These are disciplines, compulsions, and banes, respectively. In death, one does not escape who they were in life. Compulsions especially fit this idea. Failing a role means failing in a human way. It means, for example, letting failure get into your head, agitating you to a point that it only becomes harder to succeed. That's the shortest of explanations I can give of this game. Vampyr the Masquerade is sometimes called more social than other tabletop games, or indeed, more political. Not in the sense that it's got room for more crosstalk or delves into topical politics directly. Well, it does, but I mean more so in that it allows for more intrigue and social maneuvering than D&D tends to. While a game like D&D has skill checks and some skills are conversational or persuasive, VTM has that structure and social combat. I will interject here to say that some people might find this to be an overreach of structuring play, but like all tabletop RPGs, the golden rule of if it's not fun, you don't have to do it is in effect. Social combat allows for social encounters to be more dramatic than a single roll and feel more like a traditional combat encounter. Convincing someone to do you a favor, or let you live, is a bigger moment. You're not just hitting the boss with a Speech 100 KYS where they proceed to walk into the sea, you're wearing them down. It also allows for a bit of losing. Backing down from social combat is, unsurprisingly, less often life or death than laying down arms against a bandit. There are still stakes to social combat though. Willpower is like an indirect buffer to mental health. Think of it like this Disco Elysium tweet, except instead of the heart attack, it leaves you open to going feral. This leaves room for consequence to inform narrative, and I love that and have talked about it before. At the crossroad of conflict avoidance and consequence comes the Masquerade. Let's look at how it's actually described.
The first tradition is the only one universally respected, but also the one that is broken most often. The crime world code Snitches Get Stitches doesn't even begin to describe how seriously both the Camarilla and the Anarchs take the Masquerade. Any transgression can end with a Black Ops team kicking in a haven door. Only the craziest of Cainite superiority fanatics dream of an age where they can rule openly. The rest have faced reality. The undead fare better as parasitic powers behind a throne than as great predators or infernal lords of human dominions.
The aforementioned Masquerade is not a magical principle or some kind of divine rule. It is the rule of a society. In terms of play, this means placing an emphasis on secrets, silencing, and indirect action. It also means vampires who look like this have some further limitations on what they can do without causing some problems, and to a degree, it stops player excess. Like, yes, of course you can't use blood magic in a live stream, but it also follows that you can't leave a suspicious concentration of murders in one place without catching heat for it. The world is surveilled, and that means play is about avoiding detection. Alongside the Masquerade being a mechanic that limits player actions is humanity, which is centered on not giving in to violent urges, to the beast. The consequence of losing humanity is fascinating because it blends the physical with the psychological. As humanity lessens, one values other human lives less and loses more human functions. For example, one can no longer digest food at anything below 10 humanity, which is as high as it goes and essentially represents a sort of vampire saint, and is a stepping stone to becoming an enlightened vampire guru who has transcended their vampiric nature after centuries of internal struggle to achieve Golconda. Don't worry about that. Point being, it's not for everyone and not necessarily common. The further from 10 humanity, the less concerned the vampire is with death and the human cost of their actions. You see, VTM takes place in a fantasy world where people are naturally empathetic and are against murder. There's an important tension formed by those two mechanics, that of not using your powers openly, and that of not giving in to the beast, aka not abandoning all human morals simply because you are a vampire. It might even prompt asking, why have cool powers if you can't use them? For one thing, it prevents the game from just becoming murder hobo D&D for industrial music fans. And for another, and you might see an interesting parallel here if you squint, games that allow for players to wield great power are most interesting when defined by constraints. Another mechanic we can get into is kindred intimacy. Actually, let's not. Okay, one last mechanic from the tabletop I do actually want to bring up briefly is experience. VTM's approach to experience is, in my view, a perfect fit for the kind of incentives the game wants to create. Per the core rulebook, players get 1 XP per session and 1 at the end of each story. The actual accrual of experience is up to a storyteller, of course, but that doesn't change that we're talking single-digit values not often correlated exclusively to combat. That's the interesting part. I'll leave you to ponder that and keep it in mind for now, and expand on it in the Bloodlines section because the impact is very clear there. There's also something to the fact this game is ostensibly in the horror genre. Well, wait, but you're the bad guy. You're literally the monster. Or are you? Yes, Dracula is the monster in his story, but let's face it, you're not going to be Dracula. You're some loser with fangs and a few neat party tricks at first. You need to have a reason to be in the narrative as an active agent pursuing a goal yourself. It's the same reason why you don't see D&D campaigns waged by some noble that has an army of underlings go clear the dungeons for him. It's the same reason why games like Skyrim are hesitant to have a "and then you became king, hee moment," because there's something fundamental to being an adventurer versus being someone with the power of an organization behind them. So returning to the horror question with that in mind, you are not the biggest boogeyman on the block. You are not the peak of apex predators. We'll come back to this later with a salient example, but it has to be noted that horror is part of this world. As for story, there's canon metaplots occurring in the world for each era and location. Think of them like geopolitical backdrops for a campaign that it may or may not tie back into. Like if you had a history RP game that took place in the real world in 1531 England, it would probably go mentioned in the background that Henry VIII had declared a new church, and maybe this will matter for your characters in some way. In VTM, it's like a feud between two incredibly ancient vampires has shaped the history of Chicago since the French settlers arrived, fueling conflict with the natives. Many kindred who entered the city become pawns in this feud without knowing. You aren't required to run headfirst into the plot thread, but it is a canon background element of the world. There are set sourcebooks that cover certain cities with lore and all that, but they also encourage people to adapt them to wherever they want. Beyond that, we have the narrative of the world of VTM itself, which I won't go into, but there is one thing I want to address. Alongside all the questions of hunger and violence and grasps at power, things that make for their own themes, we see another one peek through the pile. Vampires in Vampyr the Masquerade are part of something known as the Jihad. In a few words, it is the conflict between the young and old, a contest of usurpation and suppression. The idea of being subordinate to the one who sired you, that has been present in other vampire media. But the framework VTM introduced by having more than just one or two individual vampires sired by some rogue count, the framework introduced in the form of a vampire society where clans carry no kinship and kindred are not kin, lets cycles of violence, the Jihad, an engine of generational conflict, of generational trauma, take center stage. Or perhaps it's wrong to say center stage. It is certainly central, but it is rarely so direct. As such, that conflict manifests in unpredictable ways. This contributes to an atmosphere of paranoia. The oppressive mechanics of hunger and humanity, of death and deception, make for a unique, if niche, experience. And niche experiences can be a hard sell. But Bloodlines, the video game, needed to be more than just some niche plaything that exclusively appealed to the double niche of TTRPG goths. It had to be more than just virtual VTM. It had to be more than a strict adaptation, but it couldn't stray from the vision too hard. But then, if we're talking about something like a video game and an adaptation, no less, we hit another snag. These things are an IP, a product umbrella with no consistency in developers, neither between games in the VTM franchise nor in the translation between the tabletop and a given game. I'll spare you a diatribe about authorship and a project like this, but just know that there's no one definitive voice at this point for what VTM even is. Troika, the developers of Bloodlines, were not a group of White Wolf employees who knew how to make video games. They were veterans of the CRPG gaming world, which itself, of course, comes from a legacy of tabletop gaming. Bloodlines did not spring forth wholly formed from the tabletop. It was made to be its own game. This brings us to a mini thesis. Much like how Bloodlines 1 should not be taken as the sole inspiration for Bloodlines 2, Bloodlines 1 isn't trying to be the tabletop experience translated to 3D gaming. And from that angle, it clearly has other inspirations to pull from. So let's look at what it is. Bloodlines kicks in the door to tell you, fuck your garlic. In Vampyr the Masquerade Bloodlines, you play as a vampire selling estrogen pills to get by. You're quickly talked through what makes the vampire world what it is, and it is and is not what you'd expect. Despite the setting being intrinsically familiar, this is the game with the most introduction into its world.
Alright now, you got the blood, you're feeling all kick-ass, feeling better than your best day living, but wait, it gets better. All kindred, that's our word for vampire. All kindred have a few things in common.
We're even given a diegetic rundown of what vampire myths are real. The setting is visually apparent. This isn't 1800s Dracula, this isn't 4th era 201 Tamriel, this isn't Nosgoth. It's here and now. Okay, so of course the game isn't timeless and can't be eternally familiar, but it was made to be recognizable as the present of 2004. This in turn makes it a bit of an accidental time capsule by virtue of being painfully contemporary when it was made. I actually love that part of things, taking us on a trip back in time to when cage girls were still gainfully employed and not just a faint memory from maybe the first Matrix movie once. In a Foucaultian sense, YouTubers have replaced cage girls as the paramount of entertainment to be consumed intrinsically through a barrier which implies the captivity of the subject, when really the viewer is the captive. What did I mean by this? The here of Bloodlines is Los Angeles, which I'm told is a real place despite everything else I've heard about it. So, the tutorial mixes in exposition that doesn't feel too out of place, and your position is a fish out of water one. You're brand new to vampirism, so it makes sense to have it all explained. Following that, your first mission is to go beat up some drug dealers in a beach house after they hurt Mercurio, the best and most trustworthy Italian-American in gaming history.
What is this lump? Is this my rib?
And this can go a few ways, from talking your way through the exchange, to stealth, to murdering the gang. It's not like extreme immersive sim levels of approachability, but it's there. Given the RPG and shooter genres normally let you take a ton of mortal wounds anyway, i.e. you don't die to anywhere between 1 and 3 gunshots in most games, the fact that you're a badass vampire kicking the shit out of like 6 guys doesn't mechanically feel all that different, but your resilience is justified in this game. Being able to heal from a stab wound in 6 seconds doesn't feel uniquely vampiric given the prevalence of passive regen in games these days. But anyway, get the explosives you were sent to grab, hand them off to Mercurio, and he sends you to meet a vampire named Therese Vorman who has a ghost problem.
Oh, I forgot. You're still new to this. Allow me to break you in. Yes, ghosts exist. Werewolves, mummies, and I'd expect a whole lot of other things I've never seen share the night with us.
Okay, well, sure, ghosts exist. Why not? So anyway, it's time to go kick a ghost's ass, right? So this is where the game does something unexpected. The hotel is scary, and not just like, will the enemies kill me, will I lose progress scary. It's like, I don't want to walk the rest of the way down this hall because I'm freaked out scary. Horror game scary. Scary in a, this level has a reputation kind of way. Side note, I genuinely cherish that YouTuber Red Queen Effect took the time to make a video with the express intent of helping more people get into Bloodlines, and it's not unreasonable because, as you might notice, the second mission being a horror hotel full of scares is a hard pass for a lot of people. Like, there are console command guides to skip it. So we introduce horror to this RPG, and the game does something extremely clever here in my view. You get your taste of being a badass vampire, the Dark Hunter, the bump in the night who can kill 6 men like it's nothing, and you are immediately humbled. You are told ghosts are real, and it's something you blow off. Okay, sure, there are ghosts in Skyrim too, and you can stab them through the chest. And then you experience the ghosts, and it's a threat you can't just badass your way through. There are other moments in this game that lean into horror, but none so potent and dedicated. Horror is an oft lost in transformation angle of vampire themes into vampire gameplay, because the player is the vampire, is the monster. But Bloodlines well, VTM in general I suppose, is a world that sets you up as the thing of legend and then knocks you down and says, but there are bigger monsters than you. This runs parallel to a theme of generational power struggle, of what VTM called the Jihad. You see, while I've just outlined the Bump in the Night as some other kind of monster, like a ghost, the thing Kindred must watch out for the most is other Kindred. A big part of VTM is that there are things bigger than you, and those things aren't even monsters or individuals. They're organizations, complex webs. The world of darkness is one that erodes the young bravado of the freshly turned and replaces it with the knowledge that threats are everywhere. You are told, in some uncertain terms, to trust nobody besides two people.
The man on the couch, the lone wolf. All others, tread carefully.
In a way, the titular masquerade isn't just the capital M masquerade of hiding the truth of vampires from the world, but also a reference to the inherent, ceaseless duplicity brought on by the Jihad. I want those of you that have played Bloodlines to think about the phrase lone wolf and who it refers to, who the consensus shifts that phrase to, and then recall who the only archetypal lone wolf character we've met is by the time we hear that phrase. I want you to think about how the game maybe sets you up to trust someone you really, very much should not. A pawn is moved. I've seen the hotel singled out as the scary part, or even unnecessarily scary, and I will concede that its position so early in the game risks working the player into the assumption that the whole game is just as scary from there on. When I hear Bloodlines and the hotel talked about, it's often isolating the hotel as the horror moment in an otherwise RPG-style game, and I think that's inaccurate in the broader scheme of the game. Sometimes you're the hunter, sometimes you're hunted, but there are always bigger things than you. Hell, even smaller or equal things that still play into fear. Few things leave you as helpless as the hotel, and after that it's right back to kicking ass and chewing blood cells or whatever, but you carry the fact that for a moment you got to see that for all your newfound power, you're still capable of being scared. This isn't a power fantasy, not in a normal totalizing sense. And notably, fear is a non-thematic weakness for vampires. It's out of character. That's something to ruminate on. The lesson of fear is threefold. First, one learns to fear the world for its other beasts and monsters. Then, one learns to fear the familiar. Vampires call one another kindred even if there is no kinship between them. And last, one learns to fear what's inside themselves. My point here is that one of the most iconic parts of the game subverts vampire gameplay in its own way, in so much as a genre/term I've cobbled together can be subverted. The thing about Bloodlines is that it's relatively faithful to how I've described the tabletop. There are some very notable departures, like humanity having few impacts that can be mechanically expressed. I earlier alluded to it as a pseudo-morality, and this game takes that position in some sense. There is the concept of innocent human lives, they're not distinctly beneath you. But funnily enough, something that adds texture to the idea of humanity as what it says on the tin, being shreds of human spirit and mindset and being, a soul, so to speak, is that you can gain some by dancing. How many players probably don't even know that? But more than a measure of your descent into monsterhood, in Bloodlines it's akin to sanity meters in other games. The concept of innocence and humanity does invite some questions of moral relativism, but honestly, while I get the way it can feel rigid, that's the consequence of abstractions being turned into a system. Humanity and the Masquerade are constraints that disincentivize certain play, in this case, killing sprees and the open use of vampire powers and the like. But what about play incentive? Where does that come in? Let's look at two clips and see if you pick up what I'm putting down. There's an absence of something in Bloodlines, or a different approach to experience. Now, if I had to articulate Fallout's system, I'd say it gives small doses of experience for every meaningful complete action. Which I only phrase that way to contrast with something like Skyrim, where every sword slap and broken lockpick gives experience. Shooting a guy to completion gives you XP in Fallout. By contrast, Bloodlines gives you experience in a story beat quest reward way, and it's counted in singular points rather than values towards a level. What do these approaches incentivize? In Fallout, the source of XP makes it so that the player is incentivized to complete actions, as many as possible. Disarm all the mines, shoot every guy, leave no lock unpicked, no conversation without trying to be the most impressive person ever. Bloodlines, in turn, only giving experience based on quests, stages, and completion, or certain specific actions, in turn, lacks an incentive to do every little thing. And that means there's actually reasons to avoid combat, to be conversational, to be sneaky. Technically, it could even be just a resource drain to pick fights you don't need to. This is similar to the more famous example of Resident Evil 1, where running past zombies was not only viable, it's pretty optimal. Why shoot everything? Bullets are a resource. Why engage in combat when it could just get you hurt? Now, Bloodlines has regeneration, and humans are health packs, so it's a little different, but you can see how the game shapes a different incentive structure than fueling a neurotic need to shoot every enemy you pass, to open every lock, even the ones you've already bypassed in another way. Hell, in modern Fallouts, I remember consciously not picking up keys sometimes because that would mean I didn't get experience from lockpicking. That's probably anecdotal, but maybe it's not just me. The game incentivizes it after all. But also, VTMB is about the Masquerade, and tearing a storm through places can sometimes feel less than RP ideal, if you follow. Either way, this ultimately means there's no moment where experience accrual puts its thumb on the scale for deciding if you want to do the combat route or the sneak route or persuasion. This is something I feel twice as strongly with games that have limited pools of experience, like KOTOR. One speech check won't make up for the XP of killing 10 henchmen, you know? The Bloodlines system lets non-combat routes be equally as rewarding. It makes combat the frivolous thing it ought to sometimes be, and it's something to pay attention to because it's gonna come up again soon. Is combat a significant exploration of vampire play? Well, certainly many of your powers are important in combat. You are a hunter after all, being able to fight is relevant. But to be blunt, the combat in Bloodlines isn't great, which is why it's nice to have avenues to avoid it at times. Part of the reason may be that Troika was, before this, making isometric CRPGs with turn-based combat, so it was a little out of their wheelhouse. Granted, that doesn't mean it's impossible for them to have made a good combat system, but the Chinese room's inexperience with wait, did I say the wrong name? Troika's inexperience with real-time combat probably had an impact. Not that their experience with CRPG combat made Arcanum normal, but whatever. And with that, we get to something Bloodlines lacks that VTM has: social combat. Bloodlines has social skills, and it has persuasion, and it has intimidation and seduction checks and all that, but it does not model the social combat system from tabletop. To be fair, I've heard the system is contentious and sometimes considered boring, and from that angle it makes sense to drop it in favor of just sticking to more familiar systems, smoother systems like speech checks. But part of me can't help wondering what's lost, and in some ways that draws me to think about Vampyr's system. How would that system even work in a video game? Is Vampyr an approximation? I don't think so, but it's definitely doing something Bloodlines isn't. My ideal system for it would be like if you took the kind of conversations I referenced in the tabletop discussion of social combat, the CRPG final boss conversations, and you removed any indicator of the skill option and just had to make the right rhetorical choices, maybe some informed by skills or evidence. I'd even take a minigame of sorts, so long as it's not Oblivion speech style. Even without social combat, Bloodlines does have social gameplay. Interestingly, including social gameplay contributed to Bloodlines' rough development. I won't go into all the ways the project was troubled, but one big problem at launch was that they built the game on the Source engine as the first external company to ever use it. Specifically because they were approached and liked the facial animations. That part of Source and their interest in expressive characters was enough to tie themselves to the risk of a then experimental engine and some impactful contract details. Part of the rules for using Source was not being able to release the game in a predefined time frame before any Valve game release. Can anybody tell me what Valve game might have been coming up around late 2004? Suffice to say, with a contract binding it to come out after a game that was highly anticipated, and would go on to be one of the most iconic in gaming history, the developers wanted to move the release to 2005, giving them more time with it and avoiding competition with Half-Life 2. But the publisher, Activision, had other plans and the studio was running out of money, so Activision pushed for that immediate post-Half-Life 2 release window anyway, and, well, things didn't go well. The social elements were important enough that they influenced not just the choice of engine, but most of the design. And it was in an effort to cater to fans of the tabletop game that the accompanying societal aspect of the world got the emphasis it did.
Do you know Gallery Noir down the street? I happen to know there's a charity event being organized there. Lots of influential Santa Monicans slithering in for token appearances. But there's one thing they don't know. The whole event's been set up by a kindred trying to establish their own power clique in our city, and we can't let that happen, can we?
It's funny to me to think about what Source Engine vampire game with guns could have looked like with another studio. But, of course, since the game was coming out of a CRPG tradition with a tabletop origin, the engine choice was because of the social play potential of the engine. Bloodlines was doing something that games hadn't really done yet, in making the open-ended CRPG-style protagonist in a 3D first-person narrative, and I think that gets overlooked. Quoting an interview from the project lead of Bloodlines, Leonard Boyarsky, "I think no one had really... Morrowind hadn't been out, but no one had really tried to do what we were doing with Vampire at the time. That was before first-person Fallout. It was before Deus Ex, or right around the same time. But taking our style of game, or a Black Isle style of game, or now an Obsidian style game with talking to NPCs, getting all the choices, that kind of game, even in Deus Ex, you played a specific guy. The whole thing was unheard of at the time." Bloodlines holds a surprised place in gaming history, not just vampire game history. In some ways, it was a template for Fallout 3, for Oblivion. If not a template, then a trailblazer. I suspect this is partly why it's aged well. If you play those games with no sense of chronological order, you might not guess which one came first. Narrowing its legacy down to the vampire side, it is, of course, the first VTM video game to attempt as much tabletop adaptation as it did, and it's, in part, thanks to some of that adaptation that we got the emphasis on characters in the world. It's hard to separate the impact it had from that of VTM on the whole. From that, it's also largely the moment where the elements of VTM manifest into the vampire gameplay discussion. Bloodlines is, at its core, an adaptation. It's an adaptation that also pulls in pop culture and gameplay expectations and creates something cohesive yet flawed. In it, we see vampire gameplay front and center as the point of the game, more realized than what came before. And even with that focus, it still offers up the subversion that is fear. It still introduces the new narrative of generational conflict. More than anything, it hands us some heavy expectations for Bloodlines 2, not only in that it precedes it, but in that it has shown us what a VTM RPG can look like. It has shown us the integration of systems and themes, of blood and fear and humanity and action and conversation. Ultimately, Bloodlines is as faithful as it was new an experiment in games as it was risky and doomed for reasons that lean managerial. Despite that, it came back. So with that done, let's look at a very different development and the future of this quasi-genre. I want to make two things clear before we get into this next part. One, I'm aware this is a section that has the highest chance of aging poorly given it is largely speculative and discussing a game that isn't even at the stage of a concrete release date. And two, I don't want this to come off too negative. The popular perception of what we've seen of Vampyr the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 so far is deeply negative already for a series of reasons stemming from obtuse corporate decisions, a decade of speculations, and allegiances to particular developers culminating in new design directions being met with further speculation and hostility. And it's borderline impossible to dig through all that and find the earnest stuff amid the culture war bullshit. That's how you get narratives like that the original Hardsuit version was badass and cool and what gamers really wanted, and that the new version is being made by walking sim guys, gross, and it's in service to the LGBTQ agenda, and that Brian, sweet Brian, he would have saved us from all of this. They're Snyder cuttifying a game that isn't out yet. They're Snyderizing Brian. Don't Snyderize Brian. He didn't ask for this. Honestly, given the rough tumble through development that this game has had, the things I've seen so far of it are pretty good in terms of looking like a game. To be blunt, my personal position is that it might be yet another in a long line, for me, of good game, bad entry in the series. I hate that that's been memed, but I've been feeling it since the double whammy of Fallout 4 and the Phantom Pain. That may lose a lot of people given how there's a brewing anti-fandom alongside the weird culture war horseshit. The common way to talk about this game is to have reservations at best, or to hate it already at worst. Instead, I'd like to look at how the changes in direction work, and to somehow connect this all to the history, themes, and gameplay concepts I've addressed so far. In a theoretical sense, Bloodlines 2 does not have to be a sequel. It could even fully ignore the first Bloodlines. It could simply draw from the TTRPG with modern software capabilities and a new engine and come out completely different. Hell, in theory, it could have been a CRPG and be even truer to the spirit of VTM. Nothing speaks to me more in the footage of Bloodlines 2 we've seen so far more than the change in the experience system. It's small in some ways, but it's also a very flattening step away from the tabletop. It's, well, a normal XP bar that fills up anytime you kill an enemy. That's not going to be new to people, and I'm not arguing that XP should be a site of innovation, but it certainly incentivizes combat. Once individual kills start meaning XP, it becomes very hard to balance the non-conflict ways of going through the world. Sure, a speech check could offer a big blob of XP to compensate, but that's not alternative, it's additive. It's inching closer to that Fallout, do every action to completion style. Eventually the differences come back all the way to Kain and Alucard versus Skyrim guy. It comes back to how things like choice will impact the game. It comes back to being your own character versus being Geralt. Usually this comes up more in me complaining about how Fallout 4 overburdens the player character with preset backstories and dispositions and even potential outcomes. Bloodlines is a narrative game with social RPG elements taking up more space than the action ones, and it clearly situates the player character far closer to a blank slate. You're newly turned. You have almost no tethers to the past. You don't have an established voice you must inhabit. Yes, dialogue choices can be meaningless in distinction sometimes, as with Geralt, but they're roleplay where Geralt's divisions largely provoke different responses at best or are just different things to say Geralt-ly. He's the same person no matter what, and mind you, that's not a dig. I think The Witcher is fantastic for that reason, it sticks to its guns. Fallout 4 fails to provide either experience, and that's the worst thing about it. Bloodlines 2, from what we've seen, won't fit a Geralt model nor a blank slate, and ends up somewhere in between. The protagonist of Bloodlines 2 is named Fire, and she is more malleable than Geralt with a mutable backstory chosen through dialogue, but some immovable core elements that are more than the borderline blank slate approach of Bloodlines 1. For example, she is unavoidably an elder from somewhere in the Middle East brought to Seattle for reasons outside her knowledge and is voiced. These choices don't absolutely pen the player in, but they do change things. Having the elder status alone, being at least 300 years old, leaves a ton of options on the table for who to be, but is undeniably cutting off a lot of possibilities too. That's notable, and the Boyarsky description of what made the first game innovative rings in the back of my head. Even in Deus Ex, you play a specific guy. And now in Bloodlines 2, you play a specific guy. I don't want to be a doomsayer, a negative person, and I won't meticulously dwell on critique, but something like the experience system change proves my point about not being Bloodlines 1 Part 2, but drawing from broader genre conventions. It's something I, personally, think of as a step in a very wrong direction, even if the combat is smoother and more expressive. Speaking of which, it's probably a good idea to interrogate if the Chinese Room is even planning to go for the same genre as Bloodlines 1. Obviously, this is still a game about vampires and with vampire abilities. The Chinese Room seems very aware of this, and you might say, yeah, duh. But if my whole point with this video is the idea of capturing the essence of vampire play, then they're on the same page as me for a little while. The studio is aware that this isn't just GTA with a nighttime filter. They understand my own concern about how vampire protagonist games are actually rather rare and how they need to have an intrinsically different position when it comes to life, death, morals, and so on. The description of most action games offer a power fantasy, I'd like to call ours a confidence fantasy, is something I'd nod along to on the first read. You see, the word action comes up several times, and confidence, we'll table that for a second. The first dev diary they put out shares a general perspective I've developed in looking at vampire games, but then it also keeps centering action and combat. The truth of the matter is that Bloodlines 1 is a clunky game, a game where combat is stiff. But combat sells games. I've mentioned this somewhere before, and it's not exactly a new argument, but the overemphasis on combat is endemic to gaming. If I want a game where I can gun, okay, there's 10,000 of those. If I want to narrow it down to gun plus nighttime plus special powers, etc., it gets narrower. But even that misses the point of what makes VTMB special. I don't go back to the game or recommend it on the basis of gunplay with a red and black wardrobe. Good gunplay, a good brawling game, is a lot easier to find than all the other parts of the game that pull deeply from the well of setting, aesthetic, and the idea of this parallel, dark world intersecting with the specifics of vampirism and the expressly RPG elements of social simulation. It's a game that's a hard sell to contemporary audiences. And that's why they're making Bloodlines 2 an ARPG. And that's a decision that I not only feel personally left behind by, but also misses the core of VTM. Remember when I said VTM is known for its politicking and social elements? I want to say, what if that's not there? But that's a what if. I don't know yet, and I want to reserve judgment while also making room for the possibility it won't be. If anything, sincerely, wholeheartedly, I am willing to defend the Chinese Room from people who see its walking sim history as a red flag. In fact, on some level, that idea gives me hope for the game because it means they know how to sell an experience on atmosphere. But I'm worried they're leaning into combat as, at best, a selling point, and at worst, as a core of the whole gameplay. For now, the reveals have focused on combat, and it irks me, but it's not a conclusive indication of where dev resources are spent, you know? At best, there's speculation. In Dev Diary 7 on combat itself, they clearly state they don't want the ability to do combat to be a detriment to narrative players, both grouped as VTMB veterans and TCR studio fans, which is an interesting window into how they see the series and themselves. But let's dig back into the concept of atmosphere and why TCR was likely chosen. Bear with me for a moment, but do you all happen to know what section of Bloodlines got a lot of independent praise at the time of release? Do you know what won an award? The Horror Hotel. There's a cynical part of me that worries whoever made the Chinese Room decision saw that story about where the game won its award and thought, well, we could do that again. And mind you, the Horror Hotel isn't a bad segment. It wouldn't be corny to do something like it again, and indeed, it's why I had the idea for this video to begin with. But the cynic in me says that they want lightning to strike the same place twice, banking on an award legacy and some atmosphere that comes along with it incidentally. I trust the Chinese Room knows how to do atmosphere, but the game isn't all atmosphere, even if the tabletop has mechanics figured out for them, so to speak. Mechanics they have no obligation to actually touch. Will what's left feel like VTM? Like VTMB? Like vampire gameplay? Like any old ARPG? I cannot say. I don't know what's going to come, but here's the thing. In the world of Vampyr the Masquerade, we're all damned. The future of this nascent genre that barely exists does not solely rest upon Bloodlines 2, but it is fair to say that VTM is a cornerstone of vampire gameplay. Understanding where that game is headed is understanding what will define vampire gameplay for a lot of people for a long time. time. Another theme I see within the anti-fandom is this presumption of soullessness, that Brian Mitsoda was the soul of Bloodlines, and it spirals into extrapolation after extrapolation, people picking apart the lack of specific canon terms in the interviews attached to the gameplay reveal. The way the Chinese room reps say things like city instead of domain, hibernation instead of torpor, presuming this is evidence that TCR doesn't care about the world it's working in. Instead of the far more logical possibility that if some guy is trying to sell you on a game and uses a word like diablerie to describe the basic premise, you're gonna have no idea what the hell he's talking about. The double bind sets in. Everything they do to appeal to anyone but the fans is a sign they don't know the game. Anything they do that does reference the canon is pandering or pushes away newcomers, and so on. It's nonsense to presume that. Hell, it could even be true that they don't care for the tabletop game, but I don't know that, and neither do you. I don't want to turn this into some kind of thing where I'm speculating what developers really feel and where the soul of the project is, nor turn this into Bloodlines' genius and here's why, as much as I want to merely set up how I see things. Let me be excessively clear. Many of the critiques of the gameplay trailer are so disingenuous they border on delusional. The segment isn't perfect. I even have my own gripes. Like, okay, you're fighting illusions, but you can still get blood from feeding on them? The developer points out that the mannequins in the section can't be fed on, and that that's an added challenge. But why, then, can you feed on the fake guys who don't actually exist? That feels like a plain mistake to me, but I wouldn't then go on to extrapolate this means that developers don't know what blood is. That's the level critique is sitting at more often than not. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the feeding is illusory. Maybe the combat is illusory. Maybe it's all an illusion and layered. I don't know. The tenor of many critiques is one of bitter, often willful extrapolation. And I don't want to argue with that too much. I'd rather just set things out as I see them. Nor did I come here to fight with the rose-tinted perception that people have of Bloodlines 1 as a game with tons of deep dialogue or quest approach choices. It is a genuinely impressive game with a lot of dialogue variation, but it's also one where half the things you say don't matter. To almost a comical degree, actually. Like, I just love how you can be an asshole and nobody reacts. Honestly, it reads as nobody putting up with your shit or listening to you. In fact, no. I was originally gonna let this point hang and hope people did their own looking around, but let's substantiate things a bit. The hotel? Choiceless. It's literally designed to be like a linear ride. Slashterpiece, you remember that one, where you break into the gallery and click the paintings in order. The choice of approach, singular, is dialogue check to get past the guard, kill him, or sneak in the back. After that is the moral choice of stealing charity money. Don't worry, it's not charity money and you can find that out and then there is no choice. In the mission Bad Blood, the non-violent option only exists in the unofficial patch. Sibling rivalry's outcome is the consequence of smaller choices up till now. This is about as complex and condensed a dialogue knock-on consequence section as you'll get. There are many quests in the game with choices, a fair few dialogue choices that matter, but there are just as many that flat out don't. Likewise, many missions in combat areas are linear. This isn't an immersive sim. But beyond that, the game deeply dips in quality as it goes, and the RPG stuff takes a backseat to bad combat. I appreciate this game a lot. I think it's super cool, but when people say it's just bugs that brought it down, that's nonsensical. The developers themselves wish they had more time to just make it better. The unofficial patch fixes the game by doing more than just avoiding crashes. It restores content cut for time. It mends dead ends. If Bloodlines was perfect aside from bugs, then the patching would have stopped ages ago. To pretend otherwise is absurd. Time will tell if Bloodlines 2 sufficiently uses vampire gameplay, sufficiently understands that confidence a la the confidence fantasy has limits. Remember how Bloodlines 1 was structured. You brawl the drug dealers and mop them up, and then 15 minutes later you're cowering your way through a haunted hotel being pelted with pots and pans, looking over your shoulder with every lightning crack to see a man with an axe that you cannot hurt. To remind you that you cause fear, and you are afraid. Remember that you are thrown out into a world of people you cannot trust, who are playing a game you cannot perceive. You are alone, silently guided. You are a pawn. A pawn is moved. Remember your position in this ceremoniously rigid, centuries-old society as a weak fledgling, born a crime ostensibly as murderable as any other vampire victim. Why should you have the privilege not to be erased immediately, no different from as though you were never turned? From the position of making a new game appealing to new people, the Elder Vampire approach of Bloodlines 2 makes some sense. It's cool, it's mysterious, it's powerful. But it's also stuck to a very different set of constraints from the first game. Some vampiric, some lore, some narrative. For one, the Jihad is upset in all this. The more Elder the Vampire, the more you'd step away from being an ideal RPG protagonist. You, presumably, cannot build up your own organization and are a lone agent. Fire was referred to as nomad. This is a double bind. It neither gives us the story of generational conflict from its most biting position towards the bottom, nor does it allow us to be at the actual top of the pyramid, to be the boot. We are ostensibly an Elder without Elder gameplay. I hate that I keep drawing parallels to Fallout. It feels almost cheap to do at this point, but the prescribed backstory of an Elder scares me, because if done wrong, it'll feel as bad as the prescribed backstory and forced motivations of Nate and Nora, stuck in a middle ground between a compelling concrete character and being free to be your own imagined character. Project Creative Director for the Chinese Room's Bloodlines 2, Alex Skidmore, said in an interview that you have the ability to confirm or deny legends about the Fire's past in Bloodlines 2. And that's an interesting diegetic way to sculpt a character to a degree, and if done right, there's absolutely room for hope with escaping the Nate Nora hell. Can you tell that I don't like Fallout 4? And for even more contrast, they seem to be aware of the concept of control as a theme, according to Dev Diary 2, which connects to the Jihad in some ways. It's similar to the interview and the combat diary in that there's a sign of approaching things that other elements left me worried about. This keeps happening where I point at a problem I see in the things we've been shown, followed by an acknowledgement of that exact concern, and I don't know if it's on me, on them, or... The message feels muddled, but also maybe that's just a sign of how they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Everything Bloodlines can do feels like a double bind. Near nothing can ever survive the pressure of 20 years of layer upon layer of expectant fans drawn to the game for reasons ranging from nostalgia to the niche it would fill, and pulling away from the idea of a sequel for reasons ranging from development hell to some shambling reanimated corpse of Gamergate. Is it even worth appealing to the 20 years of fans? Can they even be appealed to? No. Layers have to be chosen. The idea of new players has to be met. You can't make a game that is in the same time capsule VTMB has become. It can't be contemporary and capture the late 90s, early 2000s. It could never be VTMB 1 again. It might simply be that, as with the RPG versus ARPG split, the elements of vampirism made more interesting in social roles and the roleplay of being a vampire is secondary to the action of being a monster in Bloodlines 2. There is a very real chance an ARPG cannot capture the kind of roleplay necessary for this same rich experience of vampirism offered by a hyper-specialized RPG experience like VTM. To be overindulgent in metaphor one last time, if humanity in the VTM terms represents making a game that captures one's earnest interest in exploring the nature of vampirism, then making an ARPG is giving in to the beast. And that appeal, the chasing of appeal, that all comes from marketability and presumptions of what will sell well, of who is worth appealing to. I know they don't want to make the same game twice, but I'm concerned that there's this impression of Bloodlines as having made its own choices for kicks, and that the tabletop elements were superfluous rather than, on occasion, negotiable. Valid and invalid critiques swirl in a messy way. Bloodlines 1 was anticipated by loyal Troika fans who didn't even hear the game came out because it was so overshadowed by Half-Life 2. It undersold Arcanum, and that game is as niche as they come and broken in a lot of ways and didn't have an inbuilt community. I can't blame the mentality of wanting to appeal to more than just a group of nerds with 20 years of expectations and zero reasons to be loyal to the studio over the idea of VTMB, of the IP itself. And that's all begging the question of if it even needs to be VTMB1 Part 2 at all, in the slightest. VTMB1 is a flawed departure from the tabletop in a fair few ways, and it turned out beloved. Years later, with a dozen unofficial patches and after bombing in sales. The creators of VTMB were, as I stated before, not a company used to 3D RPGs. They built CRPGs, which can be argued as closer to the TTRPG experience in a few ways. A VTM CRPG would be more pure and correct, but it wouldn't necessarily be a better game. A VTM game with a party of characters wouldn't necessarily be intrinsically better. The lack of a party is never something I see cited as a failing of Bloodlines 1, even if it is very obviously a conscious deviation. Bloodlines was a terrible buggy launch, and frankly, given the history, Bloodlines 2 doesn't get the clean and we'll do it right this time sort of opportunity. It's also messy. It's messy on top of 20 years of expectations and over 30 years of tabletop memories on top of a broader cultural expectation of what a vampire even is. Vampire games are nebulous in definition and are themselves not some imagined peak of game design. In the end, Bloodlines 2 doesn't have to be Bloodlines 1 redone to be a VTM game, doesn't have to be VTM to be a vampire game, and doesn't have to be expressly vampiric in its play to be good. But I feel like we lose something for each of those elements peeled away. Thanks for watching this very long video that sort of starts one place and ends another. I hope my train of thought was comprehensible. Thank you first and foremost to Len, who gave me some much-needed script suggestions and perspective, and who, among many other things, hosts a podcast called 3 Moves Ahead, which I've been on, by the way. It's about games, usually strategy ones. There's some overlap with my core audience, which, hint hint, means you, dear viewer, might like it. All her links will be below, to the side, wherever the description is now. Sincerely, it's great that she was willing to respond to me when I just messaged being like, you seem the sort to have vampire opinions. Thanks also to Freda, who puts up with my ceaseless efforts to cast him in line reads that have absolutely nothing to do with our overlapping interests or shared audience. And of course, thanks to all the patrons who make things like this possible at all. In particular, we have John Ursa, Cesare Mikula, Defender, Freddy, Galactic Beyond, Isaac of Lyria, Lissing Afame, Mark Soto, Michael Kelly, Nick, Nitopir, Knife Suggestion, Sippa Turnipsy, Queen Naked Molerat, and Vichire. Mostly out of everything, I'm glad I managed to get this video out before H. Bomber Guy's very loosely alluded to video on Bloodlines, for nothing more than the petty satisfaction of getting to say, aha, see, I have some independent thoughts about this, there's no way they were influenced. Or something. Look, I don't understand how brains work, I don't know why I'm compelled to come off as original. Bye. I dreamt of a blonde maiden. I drew near and saw she was crying, but her tears were red as blood. I touched her tears and tasted them, and they were wonderfully salty, sharp with spice and savor. But the maiden's face had changed, her skin gray-white, and red tears dripped from her lips, and her hair had turned black, and wreathed her head like twining snakes. I was afraid, but I could not run. I screamed, and then I woke, heart pounding, cramped and aching.